the Civil War Institute and Robert Fluhrer Professor of Civil War Studies at Gettysburg College. He teaches courses here on the Civil War, the American South, and public history. He holds a PhD from Pennsylvania State University. He's held teaching positions at West Virginia University and the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. He's a popular presenter for teacher workshops under the auspices of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. In addition to dozens of articles, chapters, and books, he's the author of The Last Generation, Young Virginians in Peace, War, and Reunion, editor of Audacity Personified, essays on the generalship of Robert E. Lee, and he's currently at work on his next book entitled The War for the Common Soldier. Please welcome Peter Carmichael.
Good morning. So, when we all get into business writing books, and we hope that our books have a lasting impact, that in the long march of historiography that we keep moving along, keeping pace with new scholarship. But the reality is, most of our books fall by the wayside. And I had that realization at a recent book signing, in which I didn't have to strain my eyes very much to see the end of that line. And as people made their way up, the guy said to his wife, "Honey, this is the author of the book that I've been reading every evening." And she said, "Oh, the book you fall asleep to every night." The person in this photograph, Douglas Southall Freeman, there's no risk of his work falling by the wayside. Douglas Southall Freeman, as many of you know, was the biographer of R.E. Lee, wrote 4 volumes on the general, published in the 1930s. Before that, he received the Pulitzer Prize. In the 1940s, he did 3 volumes on the Army of Northern Virginia, entitled Lee's Lieutenants. All his work is beautifully written. He had prose that is, I think, equal to Bruce Catton's. Like Catton did incredible original research. It's true, though, that Freeman was very much enamored with the general. In fact, he admitted to this. This is not an apocryphal anecdote. Every morning, as he walked to work, he would salute the statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond. A little odd, I would say. But nonetheless, he had great admiration for the general. And he was, I should add, a professional historian. Freeman grew up in Virginia, did his undergraduate at the University of Richmond, and then went on to Johns Hopkins, where he got his PhD. He didn't enter the academy. He decided to work for a living and was a journalist, 2 different papers in Richmond. And his historical output alone is amazing. I mean, this should remind you of our conversation with Gordon Ray yesterday, who has a real job as a lawyer and then also does historical scholarship. Freeman also, he maintained an incredible work ethic. He got up every morning at 2 o'clock. This is a picture of him in his office. He would work from 2, I believe, to something like 6 or 7 in the morning. And then if you go to the photograph, you can see there's a microphone where he did a daily radio show. And then he went off to the newspaper office and was a full-time editor. So really quite remarkable. His output, his scholarship, deeply influential, although it is certainly cadence of his. His interpretive foundation, it's there. There's a lot of rubble because of the revisionist scholars. And of course, their critique of Freeman is that he simply presented us a sanitized Lee. And he was very selective in the evidence that he used in his presentation. And so I'll give you one example. He spoke to an audience at the War College talking about leadership. And in this, he made an observation about what constitutes good generalship during the Civil War. He said that a great general must recognize between what was practical from what was desirable. A soldier who cannot make that distinction, Freeman declared, will never get anywhere. Now, Freeman was referring to Confederate General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. Beauregard had fantasies about joining with Lee's forces around Petersburg and Richmond and then marching on Washington, D.C., short stop in Baltimore, then on to Philadelphia, and of course, their final destination would be New York City. Of course, that would be giving up Richmond and Petersburg. This kind of flamboyancy with Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard is understandable. If your parents name you Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, you're a little grandiose in your place. But my point is simply this, is that Freeman should have applied this rule to R.E. Lee, and if he had done so, he would have come up with, I think, a more critical, more incisive, and actually more lasting interpretation of the general. So my argument is very straightforward. And note that I just changed the slide to distract you as I tell you my argument. It is simply this. By the fall of 1863, Lee's expectations of his army had far exceeded what it could actually accomplish. During the preceding 24 months before June 1st, 1864, before the fighting at Cold Harbor, Lee had lost roughly 100,000 men. Now, of course, he was keenly aware of his diminished strength, but at the start of the Overland Campaign, R.E. Lee was still searching for that elusive victory of annihilation, or you can call it an American Waterloo. What's really odd here is that Lee's thinking on this subject after 1863 in no way evolved or changed. Many of his peers, especially on the Union side, they had adjusted to the reality of Civil War warfare. They recognized that Civil War armies were virtually indestructible and that the battlefield almost never resulted in decisive strategic results. So 64 Lee has these grandiose plans and the expectation that Grant would be destroyed in a single battle. What's surprising here, though, is that the Southern press and the Southern people, they were modest and realistic in their expectations. This was not the case in the North. Brooks Simpson has written a very good piece called Great Expectations. You got your pen out here to give out some book titles. This is a very fine volume of essays on the Wilderness Campaign called The Wilderness, edited by Gary Gallagher. That's where Brooks' article appears. Great Expectations, in which Brooks finds that Northern editors promised their readers that Grant would deliver a knockout blow in the Overland Campaign. Lee never faced this same kind of pressure that Grant did. And of course, he had the political clout in Richmond, the latitude to take a more strategically conservative approach. Grant simply didn't have that option. So finally, I want to suggest this, that Lee should have abandoned his Spotsylvania line after May the 10th. He should have retreated across central Virginia. That area was logistically barren. And of course, he could then consolidate his forces around Richmond and Petersburg. That's something that we can discuss during the question and answer period, is that there's a perception that once Lee's army fell back to Petersburg and Richmond, entered siege warfare, it was simply a matter of time, and I obviously don't agree with that. If he, in fact, had done that, if he had left the Spotsylvania lines after May 10th, he would have probably saved himself, according to my estimates, about 20,000 men. 20,000 men. And of course, Grant would have been obliged to do what? To attack him. So, Lee's standard of victory in 1864 should not have been a victory of annihilation. It should have been a stalemate. And as we know, in May, Atlanta wasn't threatened. Joseph Johnston was grinding down Sherman's army. Lee could have done the same, because what's the prize for these campaigns in 1864? It's the defeat of Abraham Lincoln. And in fact, it is the defeat of Abraham Lincoln that is the Confederacy's last best hope for Southern independence. Now, before we dive into the details of this argument, we need to do a little historiography. And when the word historiography comes out of my mouth, it's like ether, right? The word historiography just doesn't settle well on most audiences, but I will make this succinct and to the point. My argument, it falls in line with many historians who critique Lee for his excessive attacking, and that attacking, or the commitment to the offense, that it ultimately brought upon Confederate defeat. This idea that many scholars maintain today has its origins in the work of many of these peers, including Edward Porter Alexander, the artillerist in the Confederate First Corps. He, of course, described Lee as Audacity Personified. James Longstreet, Alexander's superior after the war said that it was Lee's up and out of courage that would not let him rest. These two examples, and there are many others, they infused the writing of early scholarship on Lee. And I'll just give you one example. George Bruce, in 1913, concluded that aggressive warfare was congenial to Lee's impulsive nature. Modern scholarship has now removed itself entirely from this idea that Lee had a peculiar lust for combat. And I would just give you one example. Michael Feldman, he best illustrates this position in his 2000 biography of Lee entitled The Making of Robert E. Lee. He explained that Lee's aggressiveness on the battlefield served as a release for pent-up sexual frustrations that Lee has suppressed throughout his adult life. Quote Feldman, at the moment when it was most needed, aggressiveness thrust up through the passivity and deep reserve of Lee. In a sense, the most approximate emotional precedent for such an outburst was the considerable erotic energy that had forced its way up through the carefully controlled exterior the young Lee had normally shown the world in his relationships with young women. Lee found a parallel, an even greater release in making war, a conscious act. Given the choice, he would attack, not wait. Now, Feldman's observation, of course, got a nice chuckle from the audience. Some of you might find them very disturbing. If you read his biography, which has, I think, many virtues, beautifully written, by the way, but if you read it, it's what many will call, and I don't even like using this term, it's psychobabble, but you will sort of reach a conclusion at the end. And as many of you know, there are all these explanations for Confederate defeat. I think we have a new one after reading Feldman's book. If the Confederacy only had Prozac. I want to quickly remind us this. When Douglas Southall Freeman wrote the following description in his 1934 Pulitzer Prize biography of Lee, no one had a problem with his biological theories as long as it purported to explain Lee's greatness. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, Freeman writes, Lee's eyes flashed as he watched his men counterattack, and the blood of Light Horse Harry fought in his veins with the calmer strain of the peace-loving Carters. Turning to Longstreet, Lee revealed the whole man in a single brief sentence. It is well that war is so terrible, we should grow too fond of it. The Feldman and Freeman examples remind us of the dangers of conflating culture with biology. Any historical interpretation that suggests that historical people were governed by animalistic impulses serves to legitimate violence and oppression against people in contemporary society. Of course, The Birth of a Nation movie, released in 1950, is a classic example. Of course, shows African Americans as free people taking over political governments in the South, running roughshod over whites, and of course, what's the greatest threat of all? That black men had this, not just lust for power, but lust for white women. And if you think about early turn of the century, especially in the South, we have on the rise lynching. And of course, the factors that explain the rise of lynching are extremely complex, but the point is simply this, is that historical interpretations are very much critical to the legitimization of social relations and unequal power in any society. Now let's move back to what I'm more comfortable with, and that is an explanation of aggressiveness that has a cultural foundation. And if we think about aggressiveness in the 19th century, men certainly prized it, but they didn't prize it in its raw form. They thought that courage should be something that's harnessed, and that should in fact be refined. Emotional equilibrium was the goal of most 19th century men. I'm not suggesting that all achieved it, probably most did not. But you read Elizabeth Pryor's Reading the Man, biography of Lee. It's by far the best, I think, book that we have on Lee in terms of looking at the inner Lee. And she does it by drilling down in research. She is just a fiend when it comes to primary sources, and she really gets into them. It's a brilliant, beautifully written book that actually won the Lincoln Prize, which tells you something. A biography of Lee that wins the Lincoln Prize. It's superb. And in it, she makes, I think, a compelling case that Lee's engineering background flowed into his Victorian sensibility of self-denial and control. Lee was always worried, very self-aware about mastering himself, but also, we should note, he also wanted to master those people who he deemed inferior, whether it be women, Native Americans, or slaves. Now, where did Lee learn his commitment to the offense in a military sense? He probably got some of that schooling at West Point, although there wasn't any formal training in military science. I suspect he read all about Napoleon's campaigns. So in the abstract, he certainly had, I think, some appreciation of the offense. But then on the ground, where did it play out with dramatic success? But the Mexican War, where R.E. Lee was a staff officer for Winfield Scott. That's where he learned to do what he called head work, getting on the ground and making reconnaissance, as Lee did for Winfield Scott, resulted in dramatic, offensive-minded victories. So, this is not about an animalistic impulse. This is the fact that Lee believed that the offense offered his army the best chance for success. We often look at Gettysburg, Picketts Charge, as an anomaly in Lee's career, and that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I think in part that's because of the very fine book, Killer Angels, movie not quite so good. Martin Sheen plays a very, I would say, somber R.E.Lee, and I don't think that certainly captures Lee's thinking at that time. And the result, though, is that we get to Picketts Charge, we stand in front of the Lee Monument, and we take in those fields, and we say, what was the general thinking? Yes, Martin Sheen got it right. Lee was so depressed that he suddenly lost all of his imagination and creativity and just lined up his men and marched them across those open fields. Well, first, what that overlooks is that the strategic possibilities of 1863, that they really required R.E. Lee to do what? To stay on the offense and to maintain an offensive disposition. There were so many possibilities that could be gained politically, and they could have only been achieved through attacking. Once his army was engaged here, which he did not want, as you all know, nonetheless, July 1st stands as one of the most complete victories that the Army of Northern Virginia ever achieved. July 2nd was certainly a day of frustration for Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, but it still was a day of impressive assaults that nearly cracked the Union line at a number of places. On July 3rd, it makes utterly no sense why Lee would suddenly relinquish the offensive. And the idea that James Longstreet had the vision that would have secured Confederate victory here, just doesn't really, it's not in sync with the reality of what was on the ground. And so when you stand in front of the Lee Monument, the next thing you need to do is the fact that the interpretive markers there don't really explain where the troops were. It appears that he simply lined them up along one extensive front, as portrayed in the Gettysburg movie. That's not the case. 90% of the people who come to Gettysburg have no idea where Picketts Division, was actually formed. It's not in front of the Lee Monument. It's off to the right by the Spangler House. Those troops were relatively concealed for most of the day during that massive bombardment. The point being is this. R.E. Lee took great care on July 3rd to try to ensure that that attack would succeed. As I said yesterday, R.E. Lee operated upon the maxim of possibilities, not probabilities. And there were possibilities. Was it his best decision? No, it certainly was not. But it was not a decision that was a knee-jerk reaction. It was not a decision because his blood was up. It was a decision made after careful calculation. So I would say what R.E. Lee did at Gettysburg is perfectly consistent with what he had done up to that point. The big question that the revisionists of R.E. Lee have raised simply is, could the Confederacy afford Lee's daring maneuvers? Could they afford that kind of casualties that he did run up? Some very, very, very high, long casualties. Could the Confederacy afford that? That's the big question. And that is the question that historian Alda raised in his book, Lee Considered. The book was published in 1991. Maybe you know Alda. He was a longtime attendee here at CWI. Another lawyer who turned Civil War historian like Gordon Ray. They're always getting on our turf, lawyers are, as historians. Nolan did another important book called The Iron Brigade. And Nolan's take on R.E. Lee was very controversial, but he's again asking the right question, and I'll repeat it again. Did these daring maneuvers, could the Confederacy afford them? Nolan, of course, said no, absolutely not. Nolan couldn't understand why people were so enamored with the individual campaigns of R.E. Lee, which Nolan admitted, if you take them by themselves, they are very impressive. But in the end, he believed that those campaigns, ironically enough, they ultimately committed R.E. Lee to the thing that he said he feared more than anything else: siege warfare around Richmond and Petersburg. There was a real uproar over Nolan's book. It was really kind of sad and pathetic, to be actually honest about it. Many people never even read the book and criticized it. One person even suggested a book burden. Because of course that promotes healthy discussion. So, in this uproar, as so often happens, people, of course, did miss where I think there's a weakness to Nolan's interpretation. That weakness is the timelessness of Nolan's argument. Look, you apply Nolan's question to Lee's operations in 1862 and even in early 1863, it doesn't make much sense to me at all. It's a time when Lee did have ample resources, he had reserve manpower, and he also had political opportunities in which offensive strikes could have, of course, brought incredible rewards for the Confederacy. To not seize those opportunities by taking the offense and simply assuming a defensive posture, again, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. But I think it is important to note here is that Lee's thinking did not evolve as the war had changed. He continued to search for that victory of annihilation, and he lamented the fact that his lopsided victories gained at Fredericksburg and also at Chancellorsville, that they didn't result in the destruction of freedom. After Chancellorsville, Lee explained, "We gained another victory, and our people were wild with delight. On the contrary, I was more depressed than after Fredericksburg. Our losses were severe, and again we had not gained an inch of ground, and the enemy could not be pursued." Many Union generals had reached a strikingly different conclusion about what they could accomplish on the battlefield. Grant, Sherman, Meade, they all saw that these tactical engagements often left both armies bloody, and then they would simply retreat to go and fight again. This is what Meade wrote after Gettysburg, and explaining why he didn't or was unable to pursue the Army of Northern Virginia. "The government insists on my pursuing and destroying Lee. The former I can do, but the latter will depend on him as much as me. For if he keeps away, I can't destroy. It's impossible to pursue and destroy an army nearly equal to my own. Falling back on its resources and reinforcements and increasing its morale daily." So here's the hard fact of the situation. And it's, I think, explained brilliantly by Herman Hathaway, Archer Jones. This is a book that's unfortunately difficult to find. How the North Won. It's a great military history of the Civil War. Archer Jones and Herman Hathaway. And in it, they make, I think, a compelling case that in most Civil War battles, you might have a brigade, division, sometimes a corps that would be routed in the field. But that Civil War armies, because of rifle weaponry, because of entrenchments, and because they were very maneuverable, they could recover quickly. A victory of annihilation, you can only really find one in terms of a field fight. It's the Battle of Nashville in 1864. It almost doesn't count because by that point, John Butler had utterly wrecked his army before that battle. So the point is that on the battlefield, it is a stalemate. It is a stalemate. Meade got it. Even Sherman got it. I'm going to paraphrase Sherman here. After the fall of Atlanta, when he, of course, wanted to begin his march to the sea, there was skepticism. Grant, as well as Lincoln, were unsure if that was the right policy. They thought that he should hunt down John Bell Hood's army that had escaped Atlanta. And Sherman, here's where I'm paraphrasing, said, "Let's not play their game." Right? We'll chase them down. We'll get a hold of them. There'll be a pitched battle, and they'll do what? They'll escape, and the battle and the fighting will keep going on. So there was a recognition amongst the Union high command. Lee never had that in the people. So now we start to the overland campaign of 1864. Lee has high expectations of his army and of his subordinates, but he did in fact have some doubts about his senior corps commanders. A.P. Hill, commander of the 3rd Corps. A.P. Hill was the man who initiated the fighting here on July 1st, which R.E. Lee did not want. And then Hill mysteriously sort of disappears for the rest of the battle. On July the 3rd, Hill's soldiers were in Essex, transferred, or given over to the command of James Longstreet. Hard to know why Lee did that, but certainly not a vote of confidence. Just a few months later, in October of 1863, A.P. Hill makes a reckless assault at Bristow Station that resulted in terrible losses, and this is one of the few instances, on record at least, in which Lee rebuked his subordinates to A.P. Hill. He was very disgusted about what he had seen and told Hill, "Let's bury these dead and never speak of this again." So there is certainly some concern about Hill. He also has shaky health, and many of you probably know this, and I think too much is made of it, so I shouldn't even tell you this, but I will say it anyways. Hill had shaky health. He had shaky health when he was a cadet at West Point. He had some leave in Gotham in New York City, and he appears contracted gonorrhea in New York City, which of course was the gift for life for him, and so he always had to contend with health issues related to that. So he was sickly, and Lee was certainly concerned about whether he had the wherewithal, the physical wherewithal, to keep up. The other corps commander was Richard Ewell. Richard Ewell in the 2nd Corps, Stonewall Jackson's own corps. There was also some concern at headquarters about Ewell and his health, which was certainly it was not physical health, it was not sound. Ewell had earned his stripes in Lee's army in the Shenandoah Valley. Actually, I should say under Lee. He earned his battlefield record in the Shenandoah Valley under Stonewall Jackson. He was a superb divisional commander who went on to serve Lee well, and then at Second Manassas, Richard Ewell was wounded severely. It resulted in the amputation of his leg, and then when Lee's army was reorganized, Ewell got command of the 2nd Corps. During that interlude, while he was recovering from his wound, he also got married. He got married to his cousin, a woman named Zenith Campbell Brown. She was one of the wealthiest women in the South. She was from Tennessee. Her first husband had died. He died because of a suicide. He was part of the Percy literary family, where in fact depression runs through that family. But she endured a brutal, horrific marriage with this man who all kinds of affairs, paraded his mistresses in public. It was an awful, awful situation for her. And then, of course, she has her cousin, Richard, who had been in love with her supposedly from when he was a young child. And Richard's stepson said, after the war, that Mazinga married Richard because she felt sorry for him. Now, I can speak for all the men here. We've all had pity marriages. Pity marriage is really quite so she was, and one of the last thing I will say is that's Leslie Gordon, who will be speaking next year at CWI. She and Carol Blesser, they edited a book called Intimate Strategies. Intimate Strategies. It's about marriages of generals and their wives. Intimate Strategies of Leslie Gordon, and it's fine. And there's a piece on Ewell and Mazinga. One last thing about Mazinga, she was considered to be a strong-minded woman. That's not a compliment back in the day. And she made her headquarters with the 2nd Corps after Gettysburg. She was with the general, and many of Ewell's officers, they said that they were living under petticoat government. And there was such concern about a man who got married during the war, like Ewell, that people started to assume that they lost their fighting edge because they got married, they got ditched. And in fact, there were articles in the Richmond paper, not pointing out Ewell, but in general reflecting upon what Confederate men, single men, should do during the war. And of course the answer was, stay single, because a married man would lose his fighting abilities. So Ewell himself, and I like Ewell a lot, so that's why I'm spending a lot of time talking about him. Ewell is a curiosity. He's very funny and witty. All of his letters have been published, edited by, throwing lots of books at you here, aren't I? edited by Donald Fonz, P-F-A-N-Z. The Fonz who has written so much about Gettysburg. That's his father, Terry Fonz. Don Fonz, a longtime historian of Fredericksburg, wrote a biography of Ewell and also edited Ewell's letters. And so that's the best source to go. There's some great anecdotes about Ewell, who of course again was a curiosity. One anecdote is that Ewell used to pretend when he was sitting in his tent, I should say pretend, hallucinate, that he was a bird. And he would chirp something to himself and ask his staff to bring him sunflower seeds to eat. I'm pretty sure that probably didn't inspire a lot of confidence. All right. We're going to move quickly through one example about the wilderness, and certainly give you all some time for some questions and comments. As I said before, Lee had high expectations of Confederate forces at the start of the overland campaign. This map in front of you is that opening phase on May 3rd and May the 4th as the Army of the Potomac enters the wilderness. Lee's favorite hunting ground, as we know. It nullified the advantage that the Union Army had, both in artillery as well as its superior numbers. Lee really lost his opportunity on May the 4th that he could have maybe attacked the Army of the Potomac while it was straddling the Rappahannock River. That did not happen. Army of the Potomac, as it entered the wilderness, Lee makes contact. Ewell's men are to the north of the Orange Turnpike. Below the Orange Turnpike, you have the Orange Plank Road. That's A.P. Hill's men. You need to imagine that the first day of fighting the wilderness were almost two separate battles. One on the Turnpike, one on the Plank Road, about a mile or so beyond between those two Confederate forces. R.E. Lee made his headquarters with Ambrose Powell Hill. So Ewell was on a hook. He was all by himself, and he did extraordinarily well in bringing the Federal Army to bay. It was a seesaw fight around the Saunders Field. Many of you will be going to the wilderness with Brooks Simpson and others on Monday. And one thing that the Park Service has done brilliantly there, one of the first parts to do it, was a scene rehabilitation. There are areas in the wilderness that have been restored, I put quotes around that, restored to its wartime appearance, where Ewell fought the Saunders Field. That is one of those places, and it brings it back to life. When I was a kid, you got off at the Saunders Field, and all you saw were trees everywhere. So now you can really take in the ground and appreciate the historic landscape. Second day of the Battle of the Wilderness, Lee has even more ambitious plans for Richard Ewell. He hoped that Ewell, and there we have the fighting on May 5th. Again, you can see, I should have pointed this out earlier, Confederates on the Turnpike, Confederates on the Plank Road. You can see the gap between the two Confederate lines. And now this is the final day of the wilderness, May 6th. If you look at the top of the map, you can see where it says Cedric, and then to the left of that it says Ricketts. That, of course, is the far right flank of the Union Army. Lee had hoped on the 6th that the Confederates would swing around the right flank and that they would cut off the Union Army from the Germanna Ford. Again, an ambitious design. And, of course, an ambitious design that would have only been realistic when prior to Gettysburg. Lee's army simply didn't have the reserves for that kind of slashing attack. It's simply not within the cards. There's a lot of delay, a lot of controversy, which we can talk about as well, and the lost cause comes in here. Because after the war, everyone uses Ewell as a scapegoat, and Gettysburg is central to this. Ewell blew it at Gettysburg, by the way, didn't, but that's what they claim, right? Who, of course, is above the fray of all these mistakes, R.E. Lee. We get to the wilderness, and it's, once again, Richard Ewell, and it's Gettysburg the second time. And so you know the song, right? I mean, it's a lost cause song. It's just, the plot line's always the same. Lee had the vision, had the right ideas. His subordinates stumbled, they made mistakes. If they'd only followed Lee, there would have been a crushing Confederate victory. Confederate independence was almost within their grasp, and we'd all be singing Dixie today, right? I mean, that's how it goes. That's the same explanation here for the wilderness. Again, this wasn't simply possible at all. And after, again, much delay, Ewell finally launched an assault against the Union right flank. And one reason why he was unable to not launch a major attack is he didn't have any reserves. One brigade arrived on May the 6th. One brigade, so you're talking about just a few thousand men. That's it. And so with that final attack, he was able, Ewell, to slam into two brigades. They, of course, retreated in disorder and captured a few officers as well. But that again goes back to my point about the indestructibility of Civil War armies. Ewell had the element of surprise. It's ideal. That's what every Civil War officer wants, to be able to pitch in into an unsuspecting enemy. Ewell had it, but of course dust settled, there's tremendous confusion, you're fighting in the wilderness, the thickets of that jungle, and of course the results were limited. After the war, Ewell was, I think, turned into a scapegoat by Lee. In a private conversation in 1868 at Washington College, Lee revealed that he was still holding on to that fantasy of a victory of annihilation. In this conversation that he had with William Preston Johnston, this is what Lee said. Ewell showed vacillation. That prevented him from getting all out of his troops that he might. If Jackson had been alive and been there we go, right? Lee predicted he would have crushed the enemy. So, the desire to destroy his adversary, of course, persisted for Lee after the Battle of the Wilderness. It continued to motivate him throughout the summer of 1864. On May 21st at the North Anna, Lee said, "We must strike them a blow. We must never let them pass us again. We must strike them a blow." 2 days later, May 21st, Lee promised Jefferson Davis that wherever Grant moves, that he will promise to be in a position to move against him and shall endeavor to engage him while in motion. Seems to me, Lee added, that our best policy is to unite upon the Army of the Potomac and endeavor to crush it. Now, Lee's sense of urgency, of course, is understandable. His desire to strike Grant's army is reasonable, but his overall designs were not in alignment with the expectations of the Southern people or the Southern press. This is a critical point here. They measured the success of military operations differently now. Early in the war, we know that the Southern people wanted offensive game victories, and Lee served them up with panache. But now, it appears that the Southern people were satisfied with a more defensive posture. In fact, they were in line with one of Lee's maxims that he said early in the war. And this is, I think, a very interesting point that Lee made. He wanted easy fighting and heavy victories. Easy fighting and heavy victories. So, I think it's even more critical that contemporaries in 1864, they started to applaud Arnie Lee, not for his offensive skills, but for his defensive ones. That was his greatest virtue, and that was the surest course to Confederate victory. By the end of the Overland Campaign, June the 1st, many Confederates equated aggressiveness with desperation. The defense became a sign of confidence, intelligence, fortitude. And I'm just going to read you one. I could spend the next 15 minutes reading quotes, but I'll just read you one from the editor of the Richmond Whig. "A bully who rushes an antagonist is met, checked, and forced back." I think that bully is probably U.S. correct. "Thrown back on the defensive, driven under cover, and then skulks away in search of great safety. He is whipped. That is the most satisfying reflection, and it is a renewed triumph of our arms. It has been achieved with comparatively small sacrifices of life." So here we have it. Lee, in many ways, who was so sensitive, so aware of public opinion, and especially Northern public opinion, he had always had his strategy in tune and in sync with what the people wanted. Now, of course, it's an absurdity to think that Lee or any other general was so concerned about public opinion as we are today. Right? We can't function now, especially on Facebook, without getting likes and approval of everyone. And I just sort of imagine Lee, during the Overland campaign, should I counterattack after Spotsylvania? Lee's life, if you want. Lee wasn't beholden to the people's whims in that way, thankfully not. So, it's still, though, is interesting here, and then I'm going to leave this point alone, that I believe that Lee, unlike Joseph Johnston, he had all the political clout in the world. He could have done almost whatever he wanted, and then a more conservative course certainly would have maybe got a few folks worried, but everybody knew Lee well enough and trusted him enough that he could have, in fact, retreated back to Richmond and Petersburg and raised a few eyebrows, but I would believe that that's not it. So, my critique of Lee's generalship. Is this just another example of armchair generalship? by historians. We sit on the pedestal of hindsight, feeling high and mighty, and making it clear that they are so much smarter than people in the past. These what-if scenarios that promise Confederate victory, as mine sort of suggests, I think they're really troubling. They're really troubling because they obscure, if not obliterate, the political and racial reality of a world where slavery and secession were to prevail. And if I have these concerns, what can be gained from this inquiry into Lee's generalship? Well, we're currently a nation of war, and what appears to be a never-ending conflict against terrorism. I think we need to ask ourselves two basic, but strangely enough, ignored questions. What are the U.S.'s political goals, and are they in harmony with the military strategy abroad? No matter how you answer this, whether you're a hawk or a dove, a Democrat or a Republican, or a member of the Tea Party, the Civil War instructs us that democracies at war will not succeed unless political and military aims are in harmony with public opinion. In the end, an historical inquiry into military leadership, to quote Alda Nolan, is of concern not only to the leader, but also to the followers, and to the enemy, to ordinary people, many of whom die, are maimed, and otherwise suffer. In short, Nolan concluded, military leadership involves responsibility for what happens to other persons. Heeding Nolan's observation is essential if we are to seek a critical assessment of Lee, the moral as well as the military consequences of his decisions, and the human price of organized killing for the political aim of slavery and secession. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions and feedback or criticisms, concerns. Please go up to the mic.
I think you're right in that it had.
Just stop right there, John.
I think you're right that had Lee, prior to the large conflict at Spotsylvania, gone back to original Gettysburg, I think that would have obviously helped their cause. But I have a difficult time believing anything like that. Obviously, it didn't happen, but because Lee is so offensive-minded, I feel like it's difficult for me to consider that as something that might have happened because Lee just, I feel like, isn't thinking this way.
Well, even if, again, you don't believe that Ari Lee has it in him to simply maintain a defensive posture, I would agree with you, and that, in fact, wouldn't have been a wise policy. What most people, I don't think, fully appreciate are the operations from Petersburg. We think of the crater, and that's about it. And if you come to CWI next year, you'll find out there's a lot more to see in Petersburg. The operations in June, July, August, into the fall, as the Union Army starts to make its way to the south of the city, snipping those important railroad links. There are open field fights. They're not in the trenches. Lee's Army does extraordinarily well. There's lots of reasons for it. The main reason, I believe, is the very best men and officers in the Army of Potomac are either wounded or buried in Central Virginia. 20,000 veteran volunteers for the 3-year commitment ended in the spring of 1864. The Army of Potomac is a green army filled with lots of substitutes, lots of bounty hunters. They're not tested men. Lee does extraordinarily well. And it's an offensive-minded approach that helps slow down that Union advance. And my point is that if he had conserved or preserved more of those men, think about 15 to 20,000 men more. And then the other thing is to consider is that Lee maybe should have relied more on a raiding strategy. That's where the Federals had turned. That's a crucial element to their ultimate success, I believe. I think that if Lee could use that as well, not only would it assisted the Confederacy more in terms of logistical support, but political support. Little victories, and that's all you can get with a raiding strategy. They, of course, are amplified in the papers. So if you want to buck up morale on the home front, these raids, they're fuel. They're fuel for morale. And I think John Wisby's a good example.
Lee Elder from Talmadge, Ohio. And I'm curious how it would have been different for Lee to fall back to the Petersburg line earlier than it eventually was in reality when he fell back later. How do you feel that would have been different for the Confederates?
So here again is a great question and an opportunity for me to acknowledge the limits of my knowledge. Is for me to say, well, I'll look at a map and Lee, after May the 10th, should have abandoned that position and moved south. Of course, removing one's army from a position in which Grant got a hold of it, right? That's probably easier said than done. And we should all be aware of this. And looking at the map, as I did in my talk, and said, well, simply just take your troops and go back down to Richmond. There's all kinds of problems. One, Grant's not going to allow that to happen. Grant sort of desired that, I believe, because he knew that Lee's army would be vulnerable in a long retreat back to Richmond. So I think that there's probably all kinds of difficulties that would present itself. It'd be very, very difficult to get back to Richmond and Petersburg with his army intact. Things that I hadn't thought about at all. Think about Antietam, for example. After Antietam, Lee, he maintained that position around Sharpsburg, and many people claim that's sort of the defiant Lee, right? The aggressive Lee, that he's refusing to get up the field, that honor is taking hold of him once again. Pride is in the way. He's risking his entire army. That, of course, overlooks the basic fact of what? You just can't get across the Potomac overnight, right? It takes time. It takes time to move an army. So I think you raised a very good point. I think that it is a hole in my sort of theory of what these should have done. Because I think it's a very difficult problem to solve.
Grant is my man. I'm a listener from Walnut Coast, Wisconsin, Chicago, Illinois, Iowa. I've studied Grant almost all my life. General Lee, I remember he was back at the university and he got a visitor. They sat down, they were discussing the war. And this visitor said that General Lee, Grant was a horrible general, and I can't understand how you did. You're just a wonderful general, General Lee. And General Lee looked at him and he said, if I was such a great general, why did General Grant defeat me? And then the other thing about Grant is he was an enigma. People say, why did Grant succeed? Everybody said, we don't know why, but he is successful.
Well, let me take your first point, and no offense, I don't believe that's probably a conversation I ever had. And knowing enough about Ari Lee, he did not believe that he had been defeated by Grant. He believed that, of course, he had been defeated by superior resources. So he, of course, was prideful as anyone in that position would be. Certainly, he had respect for Grant, but I think that he would argue that his army was ultimately worn down by and I think Grant felt the same way about Lee. He had respect for Lee, but in the end, he believed that he had outgeneraled Ari Lee. And here's again the thing that hasn't really come up in our discussions so far in the conference, is that we need to get thinking about Grant as a mastermind of U.S. strategy, right? Throughout the Confederacy. We can't just focus on Virginia. He's orchestrating all Union armies. And one reason why he relinquished so much control to George Ward Meade is because he simply could not handle those administrative duties. And so he had lots of other responsibilities and he did everything. So bringing about the simultaneous advances throughout the Confederacy was a way to stop the Confederacy from shifting troops from various critical areas to meet uncoordinated Union advances. Grant was able, I think, to solve that problem and then to rely on a raiding strategy that tore at the guts of the logistical base of the Confederacy. Certainly, Grant wore down the Confederacy, but he didn't simply do it by just lining up his men and attacking. He is the grand strategist here, and for that, I think that's where he deserves a lot of recognition.
Al Mackey from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I've heard Garrett Gallagher make the point that Lee's actual target was the northern morale, northern populace morale, so that they would get depressed and then force the Lincoln administration to negotiate an end to the war, ending in Confederate independence. How would this retreat that you postulate play into that? It seems to me that would be counterproductive if Gallagher is correct.
Well, Dr. Gallagher is right about many things, but he's wrong about this. He did a hell of a job. He did a hell of a job training graduate students. Did a great job there, but he's made a couple mistakes in there. I think he's just flat out wrong. The Army of Northern Virginia was in retreat, and of course racking up huge casualties, and so they were in retreat, and that, of course, at least didn't appear to affect Southern morale, and at the same time, Northern morale is on the brink of what? Brink of collapse. So my point is that Lee gave up a lot of ground, but he gave up a lot of ground with a high body count, and that still hurt Northern morale. And so you've helped me now, so I can reinforce this, I believe, critical point. Look, in May, nobody knows that Atlanta is going to fall. And when Atlanta fell, that's pretty much sealed the deal for Lincoln's re-election. But we need to reinforce the point here. When you look at military campaigns, they're inseparable from politics. This is the great prize. The great prize is to make sure that Lincoln's not re-elected. And what the Confederate administration needed to do politically is they needed to be more patient. And Keith will probably speak about this, and I hope that he agrees with me when he talks about the Atlanta campaign. It's my sense that the Army of Tennessee had great faith in Johnston, and that Johnston's problems were very much a problem with Richmond authorities. I wish that, I think that if you're looking at it from a Confederate perspective, some patience needed to be shown toward Joseph Johnston. But of course, they've been through this dance before with Johnston, right? In 1862, when you hear the keys to Richmond over to the plot, I think that they saw the same thing happen.
Mike Bartels from Smithtown, New York. My question is that at the beginning of the war, both the Union and the Confederacy were able to wage war, but at this time, obviously, Lee was focused on the relentless attack in 1864 against the invading Union Army. So, but in 1863, he'd already tried to push into the north with Gettysburg. And he had obviously, I'm not going to say squandered, because that's not what he did, but he gave up a lot of resources in that attack, in that advance earlier in the 2-year period before Lincoln's election. So perhaps maybe if he waited until 1864 to carry on that sort of push into the north with this kind of strategy, if he just kind of waited, would he perhaps have had more of a chance of that?
It's a very good question. So 2 points here. First, of course, the raid into the north was, I think, the proper way to define or describe it in 1863. Of course, it had to be set up with victories. Those victories came, and as Lee saw it, I think rightfully so, those moments, those opportunities, who knows when they're going to present themselves again. And so to look at the spring, summer of 63 as a chance to bring the war into the north, that's something that all these forces have to come together, and Lee understood that he's not controlling the war with a joystick, right? And so here is that moment that he seized upon. The second point, and this is an important one if you want to read, I think the very finest work in terms of a military campaign study is Joseph Harsh, H-A-R-S-H. Joseph Harsh, you can look him up on Amazon. He's got a number of books on the war in 1862, culminating with the raid into Maryland and Antietam. Harsh makes this critical point, that R.E. Lee looked at the situation in 1863 and before and understood there was only so much sand in the hourglass of the Confederacy. And so it was the limited resources that Lee knew was at the South's disposal, that's what compelled him to fight, that a protracted conflict ultimately would doom the Confederacy. So that flips Nolan's argument on its head, right? And now, again, I think that Harsh's argument is a better one because it's historicized. It sees the war from Lee's eyes, and it's compelling work. We have time for one more question? One more question, quickly.
David Rosen from Alexandria, Virginia. I wonder if we had had a Lee who would, rather than being the general that he was, had been sort of a hybrid Lee Johnston, whether he could have given rise to the lost cause legend and the icon that we now enjoy chipping away at.
Let me step back to that. In terms of the lost cause, something that we've always talked about at this conference. We have a few sessions devoted to it. Let me just, in a very generic way, say this. White Southerners that have a unique history in that they faced military defeat, they faced the destruction of slavery, and with that there is a guilt and there's a burden.
quote Stephen, we're having to live up to military defeat and to the ownership of slaves. So an explanation that came out of that we call the lost cause. I don't care who the cast of characters. Ultimately, a defeated people who believed that they were a Christian people, who believed that God would ultimately decide this conflict in their favor, and they wake up in April of 1865 and say, uh-oh, this thing didn't turn out quite the way we had imagined. They have to do a lot of explaining. They have to do explaining to themselves and to the outside world. That lost cause is mythical, it's false, as it is in some instances. There is a realism to it, and that realism is very much grounded into the reality of the post-war world in which the bottom rail is now on top, that's African Americans, and of course they're going to do everything they can, fight away to try to regain that authority that was lost before. Thank you very much.